You are standing in a country with almost nothing left standing. The year is 1953. An armistice has just been signed, not a peace treaty, just a pause in shooting that technically continues to this day. Behind you, 3 years of war have leveled roughly half of Seoul's buildings. Ahead of you, there is no functioning steel industry, no reliable electricity grid in most of the countryside, and almost 5 million people who have been displaced from their homes. How do you rebuild a country from that? Not metaphorically, literally. Where do you even begin? When the roads are cratered, the farmland is scarred, and an entire generation of working-age men has been killed, wounded, or scattered across a divided peninsula? Most people assume rebuilding starts with money. It didn't, not really, because there wasn't much money to start with. What it actually started with was triage, in the most literal sense of the word. Historian Bruce Cumings, who has written extensively on this period, has described the early 1950s in Korea as a society functioning on emergency aid, mostly from the United States, simply to keep people fed while any longer-term planning could even begin. Picture what daily survival looked like in those first few years. A family might be living in a shelter built from scavenged wood and flattened tin cans pulled from the rubble. Food often arrived as surplus grain shipped in from abroad, distributed through refugee stations rather than grown locally, because the farmland itself had been fought over more than once and needed years to fully recover. This was not a nation quietly getting back on its feet. This was a nation being kept alive by outside support while its own institutions were rebuilt almost from zero. The physical reconstruction came first, because it had to. Roads needed to be passable before anything else could move. Bridges over the Han River, several of which had been deliberately destroyed during the fighting to slow enemy advances, had to be rebuilt before goods, workers, or food could reliably reach the capital. Simple, unglamorous infrastructure work, done by hand in many cases, because there was little heavy machinery left intact to do it any faster. Here's where the story usually gets skipped over too quickly in most retellings. Reconstruction in the 1950s was slow, uneven, and often deeply frustrating for the people living through it. Corruption siphoned off a meaningful share of foreign aid before it reached the people it was meant to help. Economic growth during this decade was real but modest, nowhere close to the explosive expansion that would come later. If you had been alive in 1958, you would have had every reason to believe your country was going to stay poor for a very long time. Then, in 1961, everything about the strategy changed. A military coup brought General Park Chung-hee to power, and with him came a fundamentally different approach to what rebuilding actually meant. Instead of treating Reconstruction as simply putting broken things back the way they were, the new government treated it as an opportunity to build something the country had never had in the first place. A modern industrial base aimed outward at global markets rather than inward at rebuilding what existed before the war. This is the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with. The Korean War, as devastating as it was, had also cleared away much of the old economic structure, the traditional landholding patterns, the outdated colonial-era industry left over from Japanese occupation, the entrenched interests that might otherwise have resisted radical change. Economist Alice Amsden has pointed out that this kind of destruction, tragic as it was for the people who lived through it, sometimes leaves room for a more aggressive kind of rebuilding than would have been politically possible in a country whose old systems remained intact. Picture the shift concretely. A road that once simply reconnected two villages was now planned as part of a route to a new industrial port. A steel mill wasn't rebuilt merely to replace what had existed before the war. It was built larger, aimed at eventually exporting steel to other nations rather than just supplying domestic construction. Reconstruction stopped being about restoration and became about transformation. The government paired this industrial push with something equally important: an aggressive investment in education, even while resources remained scarce. Schools were rebuilt as a priority alongside roads and factories, not after them. By pouring money into literacy and technical training throughout the 1960s, the country was deliberately building the workforce its future factories would eventually need, years before those factories existed. Land reform played a quieter but equally critical role. In the years just after the war, a sweeping redistribution of farmland broke up the large landholdings that had concentrated wealth among a small elite, distributing plots to the tenant farmers who had previously worked land they didn't own. This didn't create instant prosperity, but it did create millions of families with a direct stake in the country's stability and eventually extra income that could be saved, spent, or sent to educate a child in the city. It also removed a potential source of unrest at a moment when the government could not afford to fight battles on two fronts, one against poverty and another against its own restless population. There is a version of this story that skips straight from rubble to prosperity, as if the transition were smooth. It wasn't. Through much of the 1950s, foreign aid made up a substantial share of the government's entire budget, and dependence on outside support bred its own resentments, both among Koreans who felt their country's dignity was compromised, and among American officials who grew impatient watching aid disappear into corruption with little visible return. The shift toward an export-driven industrial strategy in the early 1960s was, in part, a response to that impatience. Continued aid could no longer be guaranteed indefinitely, so the country needed a plan that didn't depend on it forever. By the mid-1960s, something visibly different was happening. Export figures, which had been negligible throughout the 1950s, began climbing steadily. Simple manufactured goods, textiles, plywood, wigs made from human hair started generating real foreign currency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was proof of concept, evidence that a country with almost no natural resources could still generate income by organizing its labor force efficiently and selling what it made to buyers abroad. So picture the full arc, side by side. A family in a tin can shelter in 1953, dependent on foreign grain shipments just to eat, a construction crew rebuilding a bridge over the Han River by hand a few years later, a school teacher standing in front of a repaired but still crowded classroom in the early 1960s, teaching children whose factories didn't exist yet, a shipyard worker in 1975, welding steel plates for a vessel that will be exported to a country most Koreans have never visited. Each image is only 20 years apart from the one before it, yet they belong to almost unrecognizably different economies. Here's what this reflects back onto you. It's tempting to think of rebuilding after devastation as simply restoring what was lost, patching the holes, and returning to how things used to be. South Korea's post-war reconstruction suggests something less comfortable and more useful. Sometimes the most effective response to losing almost everything isn't to rebuild the old structure brick by brick, but to use the empty space that destruction leaves behind to build something the country never had the chance to build before. You started this standing in the middle of rubble, wondering how anyone comes back from that. The honest answer is that South Korea didn't simply come back. It used the wreckage as a foundation for something entirely new, built slowly, imperfectly, and at enormous human cost, by people who mostly never got to see how the story would eventually end.